Great. Okay. Welcome to what I believe is the last class of the semester. So, allow me to begin by saying thank you for sticking with us and thank you for the work that you've put into this course, especially for the students, but also to the members of the public who've been joining us every week, either on YouTube or live. Thank you for taking this journey. It's every time you teach a topic such as Sufism or such as Islam, in one variety or another, it's an opportunity to deepen your learning about it. And I must say that this teaching this course is always such a wonderful learning experience because it allows you to revisit old friends in terms of books and scholarship, and allows you to play once more with it and bring new elements in. And especially if there's a change in format, such as going online this year, it brings challenges, but it also can bring a bit of fun. I'm just going to change my glasses here because I noticed that those ones are filthy from cooking. That is definitely my fault. Okay, wonderful. All right, let's take a look at the subject matter for today. So basically, what I wanted to cover in our last class is a bit of a discussion of what comes next in terms of Sufism. Where is it going? Where is the movement shifting? Are they going online? Are they finding other ways to survive the coronavirus pandemic? And also, and additionally, because we have spent time in almost every class also discussing criticisms of Sufism, it sort of behooves us at this stage to look in a more general sense as to what kind of critiques were offered about Sufism. And yet again, for members of the public who are joining us on YouTube, there are going to be a couple of links embedded in the slides, and we're going to be checking out a couple of videos to sort of help our analysis along today. And so I will be pausing the recording during those times for copyright purposes, but I believe the links will be provided for you by the very, very helpful Ms. Webb at St. Mary's. Okay, let us get right into it then. So one of the things that we sort of need to orient ourselves to and understand when we're talking about Sufism, especially in the modern period, is often if you hear Sufis talking, if you even are attending a course like this, um, you're going to often hear uh, Sufis speaking in a sort of a defensive posture, and that's often because my suspicion is that the very loud voices in the room, people like the uh, Osama bin Ladens of the world, and the Khomeinis of the world, and the ISISes of the world are very, very loud. And it often seems like any movement that does not conform to this very narrow and rigid version of Islam to which they ascribe, it falls outside of the fold, or it becomes the responsibility of Muslims to find how they relate to these movements. And somehow there's this bizarre game of history that seems to be taking place, in which the more conservative, the more brutal, the more vicious a particular movement is, the more it receives this air of authenticity. And often, in terms of how Sufis have responded to this vitriol, it's interesting to see how both they have internationalized, i.e., spread themselves online and through programs created in countries in terms of international law. So, Sufis becoming internationally relevant. Take, for example, the case of India and Pakistan. That border is not very porous when it comes to an academic wanting to visit India to do research, but is very porous if you were a Sufi musician in Pakistan. It's possible to cross over into India to give performances, to participate in the making of movie soundtracks. So Sufism kind of carries a certain cultural currency. Uh, Perhaps one of the reasons that this happened is also because of September 11th. And we're going to talk a little bit about how that affects the story that we're discussing. But it behooves us, and I know I've used the term twice already today, um, to explain what Salafi means. So when you hear the term Salafi, it often refers to movements in Sunni Islam that link the modern exercise of the tradition to the imaginary of the Salaf or the ancestors. And I say here the imaginary because we don't exactly know how they lived, right? We don't exactly know how Muhammad lived. We don't exactly know how the people at his time period lived, but we do have a lot of documentary evidence of varying sort of shades of reliability that give us a fair sense of what was going on at the time. But whether or not that fair sense can then be translated into a political system or a legal system or a cultural system is sort of what a lot of these groups that are referred to as the so-called Salafi do. The belief stems from the idea that Muhammad lives a pure Islam that exists in the time of himself and the pious ancestors, literally the Salaf, and they are mainly reliant on sort of these fundamental bases of the tradition. And again, I'm a bit hesitant to use the term fundamentalism when referring to Islam because it's, in honesty, a more appropriate term for Christianity, especially since even the origins of the term itself refers to a series of periodicals in the 1920s in the United States called the Fundamentalist Papers, which were a discussion of how to live life closer to the time of Jesus, right? So it's an improper lifting of a term, but as Martin Marty and Scott Appleby, in a very important project that was launched in the late '90s and early 2000s, talk about in their Fundamentalisms Observed project, that there's a familial resemblance between these fundamentalist movements, whether they be Sikh, whether they be Hindu, whether they be Muslim, that there's certain familial traits. And one of the traits is the fact that all of these movements reinterpret history. So whether or not you're reinterpreting history, for example, in Ayodhya to destroy a 500-year-old mosque, as the Hindus did in the 1990s, or not like all Hindus, just the ones who showed up and actually tore apart the mosque. But is if we're referring to the fact that they claimed that that was the birthplace of Rama, but it also was the site of a 500-year-old mosque, and the decision was to tear it down. And just recently, the Indian Supreme Court declared that a new temple can be built on the site. When those kinds of, with that kind of use of history takes a mythological, storied approach and then marries it to the politics of the modern nation state. So that kind of stuff is going on in all of these so-called fundamental movements. So you're going to see a massive reinterpretation of the past and a deployment of the past for the exigencies also of the future. So that's one familial reference or relevance found by Appleby and Scott and Marty in this fundamentalisms observed, and another is often a willingness to adapt to new technologies for dissemination of information, for example, the internet, and also in terms of the ways that they get funding and who they get funding from. It's usually going to be fairly isolated. In the case of Salafism, state funders will be in Qatar and in Saudi Arabia. Um, Also, these groups will usually have a very broad transnational reach because they will help fund other groups and other politics um, in the kind of Muslim world. So, for example, groups like the Jamaat-e-Islami, the Muslim Brotherhood, can receive outside support, and then also on the lower level, for example, if you were to look at northern Pakistan, you would find that about maybe in the last 25 years or so, over 1,000 madrasas have been opened, funded by money coming from the Gulf. To sort of structure Islamic education in Pakistan. And what it often also does while it's building this kind of new educational model is it's interested in reinterpreting what is legitimately Islam, what counts as Islam and what falls outside of that fold. And this kind of Wahhabism or Salafism runs rampant in places like Pakistan, and it is a major concern for the government because it tends to undermine folk versions of Islam, which is often where Sufism itself can be found, such as shrine culture. There's just been a series of bombings in Pakistan, and also the kind of lived everyday Sufism of people on the bottom, right? And one must often forgets that the main targets and the main killings done by groups such as ISIS and others are other Muslims, are the main dead, and because the first thing that these movements like the Salafi do is that they isolate what they believe to be authentic and then attack anything that is not. So this is sometimes why you see Sufis and others often on the defensive because of the prevalence of Salafism and as a response to modernity. Um, and you're going to see to a lesser extent Salafism had a massive impact on Islam in places like the United States and Canada, partially because the MSAs or the Muslim Student Associations at universities up until the 70s were funded by the Saudi government and others. It was essentially a way to encourage reversion, is the term that they will use to Islam, i.e., that Muslims that have become lax because their parents maybe haven't taught them this is kind of antiquated approach to Islam or this pure Islam, because their parents haven't been teaching them that their parents have failed them, and so it uses a combination of psychology, arguments based on logic from this early period in the past, and this pride, cultural pride in being Muslim, but Muslim again, as defined as a thin band of practice. So those are the salaf, and often jokingly, at least, like when you are amongst family, right? Salafi stuff is often also encoded in dress codes. So, for example, you can see the influence of Salafi Islam in places like Pakistan, which in the 1980s, when I was growing up, women in general did not cover their heads, and in fact, it was a matter of some comment when Benazir Bhutto first came on the scene publicly, and she actually draped her dupatta or her shawl over her head, and when she would do that, people thought she was being conservative because she herself had gone to a British sort of derived school, the Karachi Grammar School. She was fairly left in her politics. She had studied at Berkeley. And so as a result, people thought, sorry, her father had studied at Berkeley. She, I believe, was Oxford and was it Harvard? I'll have to double check. But Bhutto basically, on the one hand, was a liberal feminist figure, but on the other hand, was being criticized by people in her own social class for performing Islam in a particular way publicly. And if you look around Pakistan today, if you were to go back today, you would find a much larger percentage of women wearing the hijab, also in styles that are not really organic to Pakistan, but rather in styles from the Middle East. And that is also the influence of the Salafi. In particular, women's circles, prayer and Quran study circles in Pakistan have been a major source of Salafism, at least in urban centers. So another thing that has become quite popular, and if you were to look on YouTube, you would find a lot of examples of this Sufi versus Salafi debate or Sunni versus Shia debate. The idea that Islam is neatly divided into these boxes that then can be compared to each other. So first off, from a scholarly perspective, there is no neat division necessarily between these groups. However, it often is asserted when people are firming up identities for fundraising purposes, for purposes of conflict, for the purpose of rhetoric, right? So that you want to distinguish yourself as different and you want to assert the moral high ground in public debate. So this becomes quite a popular format. I'll pause briefly here while we take a look at an example of how this debate looks for amongst Australian ulama, and we'll check that out. But a few things I want to call your attention to in advance of the video. They're being pretty careful about how they talk about Islam and engaging Islam. Number one, because this YouTube video is a public document. And as such, all Muslims are going to be responsible for the kinds of stuff they say. So you will not hear them discussing touchy subjects like whether or not homosexuality is appropriate, or whether, I mean, like, it's a biological fact, but it's whether or not they decide that it's acceptable in the eyes of Islam. Like there are many that say it is. Or that Islam doesn't have a hard opinion on it, but a lot of the figures in these videos are quite conservative, but having to sort of bend themselves to avoid extensive critique. In addition, the Salafi position you will notice, as in this video, is very rarely defensive. They believe that they are right, that they are in the right, that they practice the one and only form of correct Islam. And so often they take an aggressive posture as opposed to a defensive posture, which is where the Sufis will often be. And then, sorry, I had half a thought there, but for the most part, you will notice that they're not actually going to be Sufis in these conversations. A lot of Sufis realize that it's suicide to enter into these debates. Maybe not suicide in terms of physical harm, but maybe career suicide, because it's the equivalent of going on the Tucker Carlson show, right? There's no good outcome possible. You are engaging with a white supremacist asshole, right? So on some level, things are going to go badly for you, whether or not you decide you're going to go on the show. So let's check out a clip of this, and then come back together for a bit of an analysis. All right. So what you're seeing in the video, and for those of you following on YouTube, when you click the show more under the video, it'll show you the subsections of the conversation. The conversation's very long. It's over an hour. I would skip to the sections where they're talking about Sufism just to get a sense about how they talk about Sufism. So there is this tendency to not dislike Sufi concepts, but to dislike Sufi practitioners. So what you saw the respondent there doing is he's trying to slice a very neat line, and he's trying to say on one side is the acceptable forms of Sufism, i.e., the love of God, the kind of philosophical considerations of Sufism. Some of them may even be acceptable because people like Al Ghazali, sort of not considered only a Sufi, but also considered a very important legal scholar, is acceptable in that way, that he's interested in the mystical side, but he doesn't go too far. And then there he's arguing simultaneously that the real problem is not Sufism thought, the real problem is Sufism people. And then he's saying it's the kind of people who are like magicians walking through fire, playing with snakes. So there's this division that he's carving, this very neat division where he's saying that there's these acceptable elements of the mysticism which we can tolerate, but what we don't like is the actual people themselves who are engaging in these sort of extra practices. Now, that distinction is actually drawn from Orientalism. Let's skip ahead one slide and I'll show you what I mean. So, here in an image sort of this painting. It's showing a Sufi or a shaman, a Sadi, or an Egyptian quack, as it's defined here, curing a sick man by pretend conjurations with serpents. Right. So the all you can smell the cultural superiority and the civilizational superiority inherent in the origins of the sketch. It was developed in the early in 1806 by an Englishman, and what you see in it is the idea that quackery or fakery is mainly what these kind of Sufis are involved in. And it just so happens that Salafism is rising at the same time that the expansion of European colonial orders is taking place. And so the criticisms that are being offered by European colonial administrators against Sufism is getting recycled and getting reanimated in Salafi discourse. They're taking the criticisms of Orientalists and using it themselves. So, in a certain way, they are deploying Orientalist rhetoric in Sufism or against Sufism. Similarly, even Salafi ideas about the construction about an essential, pure, ideal early Islam comes a lot about out of fundamentalist movements in Christianity that were trying to do similar things as well. And so they are borrowing heavily from the West in terms of these concepts of history, the structure of the past, and also Orientalist literatures. Take, for example, this quote here by A.J. Arbery in 1950. Now, I'm just going to put a couple of things in perspective to you. Arbery is a very famous translator of Sufi texts. In addition, we have used his translation a couple of times in the course with regards to his translation of Attar's book on the Awliya, the friends or saints of Islam, was translated by Arbery, but yet, while he is spending his career committed to this subject matter, this is the following is his opinion on Sufism. Every village or group of villages acquired its local saint to be supported and revered in his lifetime, worshipped and capitalized after his death. Few indeed were the voices that dared to protest against this ruinous order of things, for politician and theologian alike feared to oppose the true masters and found it easier and more profitable to share in the swindle. What Arbery is referring to is in the creation of countries like Pakistan, a lot of times the federal government had to acquiesce to local power holders to secure federal power. So, in the case of the peers, for example, in Punjab, in Sindh, in the regions that would come to be West Pakistan, when the federal administration was being formed, they needed local loyalty and they needed local support and they needed local funds. And the way that an easy way to acquire that was to be in a good relationship with the local peers or the local peers shrines. They would have an interest also because they had large land holdings, and so working closely with the federal government was a very important strategy in kind of wooing local religious sentiment. Usually, in a sort of a pessimistic way, it wasn't necessarily acquiescence or desire to protect that form of religiosity, but rather to deploy it politically for purpose. This has continued since the origins of Pakistan. So you saw saints and peers shrines being invoked in the early period and the formation of Pakistan, in the build up to Pakistan. Following that period, you see it coming up again in the 1950s and the 1960s in Pakistan. You see it rising up when Bhutto's father, not Benazir's father, is rallying the Sufis and the peers to try and promote his own Islamicization program in the early 1970s. You see, again, to a lesser extent, it happening now with Imran Khan as well, who rather famously had a Sufi peer as well. And but the criticisms that are coming about the Sufis simultaneously. So on the one hand, you're wooing them. On the other hand, there's this criticism coming from the Oriental taskmasters. And what the Orientalist scholars are narrating is they're trying to explain, much as the Muslims themselves, they're trying to understand why was it that in the 18th century, Islam, which seemed to be so powerful, so successful, so pervasive all over this swath of civilization in the middle of the middle band of the world, why was it in decline? Why were colonizing powers able to come in? Why were non-Muslims ruling in Muslim places? And essentially, these sort of sorry, the cat. These sort of questions were very intensely raised at this time because the Europeans were trying to narrate what cause or what claim of right they had in asserting colonialism. So, on the one hand, as we've discussed in previous classes, colonialism is asserting a civilizational project. The entire world deserves to be civilized. The entire world deserves to exploit land in the right way. And because this is the right way and the only right way, it narrates history in terms of uh, caves to condos, right? It says that there's a single band, a single approach of history. All civilizations are on the same march, and the ones that are ahead are going to necessarily exploit the ones who are behind to try and move them forward too. So they had to first claim that Islam was in decline. And the blame for the decline of Islam was blamed on Sufism. It was blamed on the excesses of local Sufism. And again, it's not to say that everything that was going on at these shrines was good. It's not to say that everything in Sufism is good. Not at all. But rather, it's to explore the interests of the different sides involved in criticizing Sufism that gives us a much deeper understanding of why they had this interest, or perhaps why Sufis are so often defensive about this stuff. At any rate, the criticisms being offered by the Orientalists, the notion of Sufi decline, the notion of the decline of Islam, and the need for revitalization ends up fueling a lot of these movements, including so called Mahdiist movements throughout the Muslim world, i.e., their belief that the hidden imam is going to return and initiate a new golden age, or that there'll be a new revival of Islam, which results in the Baha'i movement, which results in the Ahmadiyya movement, which results in all of these sort of explosions, including a Mahdiist movement in Sudan. So these the revivals of Islam are taking multiple different forms. Some are taking very conservative forms in Salafism. Some are taking modernist forms, such as Muhammad Abdu, thinkers like Iqbal, and alternatively, they're taking Salafi forms, which is the revitalization of Islam and the purging of all of these new elements they claim introduced by Sufism. Just let me take a breath and a pause here. Does this relationship make sense? The relationship between colonizers, reform movements, and kind of folk Sufism, as well as then perhaps some intellectual questions that are raised by those connections. Do those Are we getting the fact that it's three players in this game? Okay. And but again, to say that they're players is not to say that they're wearing necessarily the team's colors, right? Like it's a little bit hard to parse this stuff out. Like when you read a 17th century or 18th century text, the author is not going to say, as a Sufi, right? Like that's that's something that we do very much today. You know, as a Muslim, as a brown scholar, as a whatever. There's this declarative statement where you put yourself on the line. You will not really see that. You have to kind of search for clues in these texts sometimes as to whether or not the author has one leaning or the other. And it can be quite confusing because, in the case of someone like Muhammad Iqbal in Pakistan, he is very heavily influenced by Orientalist ideas, but yet is involved in a very spirited defense of the soul of Islam in his book on the revival. Okay, let us keep moving forward if I don't see any other questions here. All right. So the other reasons why the Orientalists disliked the Sufis is Sufis were actively involved in resistance and oppositional movements. Um, and just if you let's again take a pause here and think about history for a second. Uh, let's imagine the city of Halifax, right? You are coming in as a new power into the city of Halifax. Who do we have to negotiate with? Let's say I want to build a new stadium in Halifax. Who would I have to negotiate with, do you think? If anyone wants to throw a few suggestions in chat. Yeah. So the government, sure. We've got to get permits, we've got to get licenses, we've got to get government permission. Who else would I need to negotiate with? Well, I mean, if you have studied at all the history of the Olympics in the last sort of 100 years, you would see that every time a stadium lands in town, most of the kind of poor housing in a massive chunk of downtown is going to get displaced, right? Especially subsidized housing, especially government-sponsored housing, that is going to get displaced. So you might end up having to negotiate with community members, right? You may end up having to negotiate with lenders to see who's going to give you the money to set up this enterprise. You may have to negotiate with stakeholders in terms of shareholders for the corporation that you have. All right, let's take that a little bit of that analysis and move it now to the 17th century. You're the British East India Company. You're entering into India. You're negotiating relationships there. First off, what you have to do is you have to provide a service which they want, right? So, in the case of India, the first step was to provide tax services, to provide surveys, to provide taxation systems, and to provide resources and goods that would be coming from the West, sometimes ammunition, sometimes arms. So there was going to be first, you have to insert yourself by providing something. Additionally, once you're there, you have to figure out who the power holders are. So in India in the 17th century, you would learn very quickly that the prince is a power holder, but not only the prince. Villages have certain amount of power. Village headmen have certain amount of power. The jirga, the local village council, will have a certain amount of power. But in addition, massive landowners are going to be these Sufi shrines and saints. So then you have to figure out, well, who can I buy and who will oppose me? In a lot of cases, authority that is comfortable, authority that is stable, will heavily resist outside imposition. However, if the system is in a state of chaos, usually outsiders can come in and make and be kingmakers. In the case of places like India, when the colonial administrators entered, they very quickly determined that the local forms of Sufism didn't have an interest in Western goods in European market, didn't have an interest in working with the colonizers. So this created a barrier for their entry. And one of the things that they could do was they could undermine these Sufi spaces by spreading this narrative of decline, but also repurposing their land, taking it, sort of engaging in governmental takings. In addition, opposing certain practices and making insiders and outsiders. It's this standard policy, colonial policy of sort of divide and rule, is that you want to enter in, find the tension points, and then play the groups off against each other. This is what happens in the case of two movements we're going to look at in terms of Africa. The first will be Abdul Qadir in the Qadriya Sufi order. He's opposed to the French and the colonial invasion in the 19th century. He forms an army of tribal, sort of nomadic tribesmen to hold off European armies, and he has a string of very successful raids against the French government. Through guerrilla tactics with light infantry, he's able to defeat a lot of French armies. Now, keep in mind, right, that on the one hand, the Enlightenment and the birth of Enlightenment democracies in the West, in places like France and places like the United States, means that there is a celebration of democracy, liberalism, sort of political liberalism, not liberalism like Trudeau, but political liberalism. So, how then can these liberal political orders also be engaged in colonial oppression? We have to have a logic to justify it. And that was that civilizational project stuff that we were referring to earlier. If you use that as your logic, if you argue that colonialism is for their own sake, it allows you to justify a great deal of harm in the pursuit of advancement, right? So, in the case of Algeria, this opposition was very intense, and so the French, the kind of democratic French, uh, sort of were setting up a colonial empire here in Algeria, which lasted then up until the 1950s and 1960s, of course, recalled in Guillermo Pontecorvo's incredible Battle of Algiers. But you can see that it was an unhappy relationship between Algeria and France, and one which France is perhaps doubly regretting because of their dislike of their Algerian migrant and Algerian immigrant populations, or at least as the press seems to indicate. But in the case of Abdul Qadir, the other thing that made him kind of interesting is he's also simultaneously he's one leading a jihad as the head of a Sufi order. So there's this sense that Sufis aren't always passive. There aren't always quietists sitting off in their shrine somewhere, that they can also get politically involved. And I, my apologies, I misspelled town here. And because of this recognition that Sufis were kind of great freedom fighters, a town in Iowa was actually named Al Qadir in 1846 in recognition, mind you, while Muslims are enslaved in the United States, a town in Iowa is naming itself after a Sufi sheikh. It's, I mean, we live in a weird world, right? Like, so uh, someone like Abdul Qadir is a Sufi leader who was also revolting against colonial rule. So this colored the impression a lot of people had of Sufism. And also we see Sufi jihads taking place even in places like South Asia as well against colonial incursions. Another group is the Senussia, also um, in Algeria, in Sudan, and in Libya, and they were founded in 1837 by Muhammad ibn Ali al-Sanusi, who fought French expansion, and also the Italians in Libya. And in the same way that Salafism was a response to modernism and Wahhabism, reformism in many cases resulted in turning away from the excesses of colonialism. And what I mean by the excesses of colonialism is shown in the case of something like the Warren Hastings colonial corruption trials. So Warren Hastings very famously, ooh, my gosh, I have to fix one or two things. Just give me one sec. I There we go. Warren Hastings was not alive in 1887, and that was rather weird to have that error on my slide. At any rate, Warren Hastings is a very important colonial administrator. He enters into what is now Bengal, and he is traveling around and he's giving the East India Company his assessment of what Islam looks like here. In addition, he's setting himself up in an opposition posture to the French, who are also very interested in India and have set up their camp in Pondicherry and have made an ally in a character named Tipu Sultan. Um, Now, Warren Hastings is sort of working with his allies to oppose that, but while he's involved in these machinations in the colony, he's also incidentally becoming rather wealthy as a result of his time there. And so when he returns to England, he is accused of corruption, and he's put on trial by Pitt and Pitt's parliament. And ultimately, he's accused of corruption in the sense that he's bringing corruption, number one, to England. Number two, he's engaging in despotism over there, and English are not despots, at least they don't believe themselves to be, especially also after the loss of the colonies in the Americas. There's an anxiety about this stuff, right? 1776, they lose the colonies. There's this new need for exploitable resources in new places. Canada is one, but also places like India for spices and what have you. And this new character starts to emerge in the British public imagination, that of the nabob. So you may have even seen nabob coffee and stuff on on sale at the superstore. But this word actually is a bastardization of the Hindustani word nawab, which is like a like a elite class, an aristocratic class person. And they claimed that he had become corrupted by the excesses of colony, and he was bringing that corruption back with him. It was also a way of the English expressing their anxiety about uh, new money coming into England. So Warren Hastings represented in a certain way just new rich, right? And every time you see a new riche emerging, you're always going to see a lot of backlash against them at the same time, because there's this sort of these come latelys who now have money and now are buying up cultural artifacts. And what you do see is that the company for colonial administrators becomes the means by which you can have extraordinary wealth. And so you see that even in the case of Lord Dalhousie, for example, he goes and makes a lot of money while he's in India, and he comes and he's able to set up a lot of stuff when he's back in Canada as well, right, and live very, very comfortably. And so there's this flow of capital in the colony that is moving wealth out of India into the hands of colonizers in places like England and in France, but also in India is concentrating wealth in colonial allies, such as the princes that will work with them. Um, and so colonialism is known to be corrupting not only by the British, but is known to be corrupting also by the Sufis, which in many cases will result in their postures against the British government. So, for example, there were Sufis involved in the anti-English campaigns in India, which resulted in a lot of Muslims not learning English as a language and not entering into things like the civil service, whereas a larger percentage of Hindus would be willing to learn English and work in the civil service. So this was also a concern at this time. Okay, the slides have stopped working. There we go. So now that I've covered a little bit of what the scene looks like in the 17th and 18th centuries, let's talk about what it looks like in the modern period. But here is a good point for a short break for us. Let's just take 5. That'll let me grab a glass of water and come right back. But I'm going to next discuss the criticisms in the modern period between this sort of Sunni, Sufi, Salafi, Shia divide. And we will get a bit into that before we look at Cybersufism. And then towards the end of the class, just for the students, we will be breaking out again as we have been in the last few weeks to just see how your papers are coming, see how I can support you in that project too. So just a quick reminder, we're going to take 5 and we'll be back right after. So uh, uh, thank you for letting me take that quick break. There's a leak that has sprung in my office, and I bought my kids a whole lot of PVC piping to build structures out of, and I currently have it redeployed directing leaks away from a window into a bucket. And so I just have to check the rig on occasion because as the rain intensifies, it's it can get pretty ugly. Yeah, as at 2 o'clock in the morning a few nights ago, I was hearing dripping somewhere in the house, and I started checking around, and I saw water coming in diagonally through this window, and yeah, it's the joys of working in an attic. So let me let me switch. Yeah, just going to take a quick water break, right? So let's switch to the modern contours right now of the Sufi and Salafi conflict. Mm, So Alexander Knish, a very important scholar of Sufism in the West, he's written a number of books, including in a book on Islamic mysticism that came out, I believe, from Routledge in 2010. Since then, he's done a new Sufism, a new history, and currently is working on a multi-part series for Brill as well on the same subject matter. And Knish has he has a sort of a secular approach to his study, in which he's very carefully juggling the polemics involved from either side. But in the case of um, the Sufi Salafi conflict, this is a translation from a document made available in the late 1990s and early 2000s in the Soviet republics. So, just as a heads up, in general, uh, under Soviet communism, there was a state mandate of atheism. However, that atheism involved also a certain special relationship with people like the. There's a. Sorry, I just saw a question pop up in the chat. There was for the Soviets there was a certain special relationship that they cultivated with the Eastern Orthodox Church, and also there was generally a rejection of Sufism and Sufi lodges as being very anti-Soviet, and so there was a lot of anti-Sufi rhetoric by the Soviet government, and also an intensification of anti-Soviet resistance by Sufis. Also, there was a real nervousness that the situation that was taking place in Afghanistan when the Soviet Union went into Afghanistan, that losing Afghanistan or having Afghanistan would be an inspiration for Muslim groups in places like Dagestan, Chechnya, and others to oppose the Russian government. So this document or these points emerge out of that context. It emerges out of Dagestan slash Russia. Um, these are the statements by a Salafi leader against Sufism. So these are his criticisms. Just give me one sec. Okay, these are his criticisms. He says, supplication, dua, or having recourse to anything other than God, be they dead or alive, sacrifice devoted to anything or anything but God, vows made to anyone but God, circumambulation of any object, such as a grave or a bonfire, other than the house of God, pinning one's hope on anything but God, acts of worship dedicated to anything other than God, adjudication or legislation based on anything other than the divine law, dissatisfaction with any ruling of the Sharia, putting one's faith in ungodly teachings such as atheism, communism, socialism, Jewish masonry, democracy, the secular way of life, and nationalism, abandonment of Islam and conversion to another religious creed, assisting the infidels, namely the Jews, the Christians, and the communists, failure to declare all these groups to be infidels, attempts to effect a separation of religion and state under the pretext that Islam provides no guidelines for state politics, which amounts to a calumny against God and his prophet. Belief in the veracity of astrologists, witch doctors, soothsayers, fortune tellers, and other individuals who claim to know the unseen, which is the exclusive prerogative of God. Adhering to the Sufi doctrine of the unity of being, or Wahdat al-Wujud, which postulates that the entire universe and its inhabitants are identical with God. Let's discuss at least what's going on here. So what we have is you can see the Salafi anxieties here as expressed in these complaints, right? So the main oppositions that this Salafi order seems to have against Sufism is the idea, one, that they are praying primarily to people other than God. And what is perhaps intentionally or unintentionally misreading is the taking of bayah, the swearing of allegiance to a sheikh in Sufism, which is quite common. In fact, with the Naqshbandi, which we'll be looking at in a few slides, you can actually do it online. You can take the bayah ceremony just by clicking through a video and extending your hand and maybe touching the screen. I don't know. I don't know exactly how oaths of allegiance work through the internet. Um, but there is this kind of concern is very great that you are ascribing things other than God. Now, that also would generally violate the opprobrium in Islam to something called shirk, which is to make God of other things. So, for example, if I was to today erect a mud statue in my living room, I was to call it Allah 2, and I was to start praying to it, that would violate the concept of shirk. I would be making a new god. Their claim is very frequently that Sufis are doing this same thing, that they are effectively praying to their sheikh. Another thing that he's maybe calling attention to is the tendency of some Sufi orders say that one of the ways that you can help yourself go sort of advance on the path, especially on the mystical path, is to imagine the sheikh or your sheikh in your mind, to alternatively carry a photograph of them with you at all times, or spend long periods of time thinking on their face or supplicating in front of a picture of them, as being a conduit or being a gateway to a mystical experience. Um, that takes place, but the way he is reading it is that is actually them shifting the focus of their belief from God to the sheikh, is how he this figure is understanding it. In addition, the supererogatory acts that it's referring to, like so someone like Halaj, very specifically, told people to come into his backyard and to pray there as if they were going to Hajj, because he was arguing that maybe there's no distinction between here and there. If God is all places, why isn't it possible for people to do Hajj in my backyard? Is what Mansour Halaj was arguing. That, of course, pissed off the government so much that they arrested and eventually executed him. Um, but that kind of act is not actively promoted by all Sufis. However, prayer at Sufi shrines is promoted by the individual orders for their own shrines. And people often will engage in things like circumambulation, like walking around counterclockwise, um, as an act of prayer or worship. So that one, again, is something that he's calling attention to legitimately. But he is claiming here also that that circling usurps or replaces the place of Mecca in practice, in sort of wider Muslim practice. So that's an important complaint. Another issue is often this complaint in Islamic sciences called Robert, I'll get to your question in just one second. There's this other issue of bid'ah. Bid'ah is also by conservatives is generally understood to be innovation in the religion, and that is innovation that means adding new things onto the religion, other than that which the Prophet and the Salaf or the first few generations approved of. And so technically, if you set up a shrine where people can go worship in India, because the prophet didn't make it to India, any worship taking place in India at a shrine could potentially be labeled as bid'ah. You can kind of see the parochial consequences of this approach of thinking, right? In addition, claims that dissatisfaction with any rule of the Sharia makes you a non-Muslim. It sort of shows you how the Salafis often engage in what sometimes can be referred to as a bright line test, that they set up a line and they say the people who are good Muslims or Muslims at all are on this side of the line, and the people who don't comport or don't conform to this stuff fall on that side of the line and are dismissed as the same as part of a Sufi heresy, for example. In addition, the other stuff that he's calling attention to, such as Jewish Freemasonry, as asked here in the question also by Robert, what he's referring to by Jewish Masonry is sometimes in this conspiratorial thought of these Salafis, there's a sense that Freemasonry is also Jewish Masonry. There's a tendency to believe in things like the Protocols of the Elders of Zion. They would believe that that would be an authentic document, for example, despite the fact that I think it was generated by Ford and others. It was made up, right? But the Salafist movements will often tend to believe this. In addition, because Masonic lodges in places like Egypt were often centers where um, Westerners could meet with Eastern scholars. So, take for example, Jamaluddin Al-Afghani. He spends a lot of time. He's an anti-colonial speaker. He's kind of a modernist Salafi, but he's also meeting at Masonic lodges with other Masonic members from places like France and England, and he's at these lodge meetings they engage in Masonic rites, and the Masonic rites for a Salafi would be bid'ah or shirk, would cross that line. right? Because if you have seen any videos or images of the Masonic orders, there's a lot of ceremony and pomp and sort of circumstance involved in their celebrations, and that to an outsider, an ungenerous outsider, may look like a form of religion as well, and also because the people that the Salafis tend to dislike attend these Masonic lodges, and they're tying in with this international Jewish conspiracy. This is an ongoing problem in the Muslim community in the West and all over the world. That there is anti-Jewish sentiment that runs deep, and it's true. I mean, it's hard to escape it, and it's often it flows primarily, I would argue, because in the Muslim world, you will see press about Israel, for example, on a daily basis on the front or near the front page. Um, Interesting, Jared. You'll see a lot of criticism of Israel built into newspapers, and it's in the public discussion on a daily basis. But whereas it's not discussed at all generally in Western press, like so, if you pick up the New York Times from today, Israeli actions would not be necessarily on the front page, especially with the New York Times. There's this tendency to believe that there's this conspiracy in the West to support Israel, to not only support Israel sort of as a Western colonial power in the Middle East that can help assert the European agenda against the others in the area. So that's the conspiratorial side of the thinking, and then therefore all Jews are bad. Like I mean, I had a guy at a restaurant in Halifax. Just out of the blue start talking about an international Jewish conspiracy, and related with Hollywood and tied into the expansion, and it's nonsense that has been spouted by hateful bigots for for hundreds of years at this point. And it just seems that we can't escape it, because in the case especially of Israel, when there's a lack of criticism, especially about human rights abuses, it allows the Salafi to narrate that as a conspiracy. They say, oh, the reason why it's not being covered in Western papers, the reason why the non Muslim world doesn't understand what's going on in Israel is because there's a massive conspiracy taking place, as opposed to our political interests are maybe tied up with Israel, or America's defensive interests are maybe tied up with Israel, and that's why they don't air Israeli criticism, versus the fact that there's an international Jewish conspiracy with a secret cabal of child-eating pedophiles or whatever the latest vogue is for attacking Jews. All very embarrassing. Let's also take a look at some of the other things that Knish has to say. In addition, the other criticisms offered in the article are that there's the celebration of the Prophet's birthday, the Mawlid, a practice which was borrowed from Christianity by the heretical Shia sect of the Fatimids, the recitation of Sufi litanies and chants accompanied by drum beats and dances, celebrations of the birthdays of various pious individuals and scholars inspired by the celebrations of the Prophet's Mawlid. They are clear proof of how an ostensibly meritorious practice, namely honoring the Prophet, can degenerate into a major heresy, seeking the blessings, baraka of certain holy sites, monuments, dead living individuals and their photographs, supererogatory non-canonical prayers, vocal declarations of one's intention before prayer, um, the reading of the Fatiha over a newly deceased and holding a wake over them, celebration of non-canonical holidays such as the Prophet's night journey and ascension or commemoration of the Prophet's hijrah into Medina, the construction of buildings or other monuments of the graves of religious scholars and Sufis, transforming them into mosques or places of prayer. All right, let's look at some of these critiques. One of the issues here is the idea of these celebrations taking place, especially the celebration of the Prophet's birthday, the Urz celebrations of the so-called marriage with the saint, with the divine, the death anniversary of the saint at various shrines. This again is problematic for the Salafis because it's a direction of religious attention away from the canonical sources, right? It's a direction, it's religious fervor directed towards a local shrine or a local place, and that is seen as negative. In addition, drumbeat and dances, because of the general reticence about music, comes up frequently. And the other stuff here is this shrine veneration. So one of the things that the Wahhabis, for example, did, or Salafis did in terms of Saudi Arabia, is that part of their asserting their claim from the 18th century onwards was destroying. Um, um, Sorry, I see a question here. Okay, wonderful. I will look into that later. Saber, thank you for that. I'd be happy to contact you at another time. Okay, great. I'll be in touch, Saber, because at least this is the last formal class of the term. And if you have any additional questions or want to be in touch with me, my departmental email is available on the website for St. Mary's University, and just reach out to me there. Although I must warn you, Saber, at this time of year, things are a little bit hectic. In about 3 weeks from now, I would be very happy to sit down and have a Zoom coffee with you and chat to your heart's content. All right, back to the issues on this slide. One of the things that the Salafi movement did in Saudi Arabia was they destroyed a number of saint shrines, but they also destroyed the mausoleum of the Prophet. Um, and this was seen as a great harm by many members of the Muslim community. In fact, there's pleading letters being sent to the leaders of these movements in Mecca and Medina. They're receiving letters from all over the Ottoman Empire, including letters from places like India, Indonesia, etc., begging them not to destroy these monuments. Because one issue is that you can disagree with a monument, right? Like you can not like it, or you can not like an old church or what have you. But when the thing has been around for over 1,000 years, I believe personally, and maybe this is the historian in me coming out, that you should protect it. I don't care if it's not yours. Or if it's not doesn't belong to your community, that we shouldn't ideally be blowing it up, right, or destroying it, or rendering it to rubble. And that's because my belief is that the preservation of history itself is an important task for the present, right? And we preserve it not only out of a desire to show how far we've come from the past, we also preserve it because the sincerity of the individuals who prayed or worshipped or attended those sites is something in and of itself which may be precious. And to hate that is something that I always feel is very painful. Actually, it's why I hate films like Indiana Jones, is because he's constantly breaking shit. So he'll collapse an entire temple to save one statue, and I'm looking at the destruction of the temple around him like, why? Why to save that one thing would you render rubble all of this kind of beautiful construction? But at any rate, in Saudi Arabia, there was this very intense push in the 18th century, 19th century to destroy a lot of these shrines, destroy a lot of monuments, to drive Sufis and Sufi shrines out of the kind of the holy places of Islam. Um, and in if you were paying attention in the early 2000s, there was a moment where the head of the Irani government went on Hajj to Saudi Arabia. And what he did was he went near the shrine, near where the mausoleum of the Prophet was, and he took a stone out of his pocket and he put it down on the ground to act as a grave marker, intentionally pissing off the Saudi government. And this resulted in a mass number of newspapers writing about this story, about the conflict between Salafism and kind of Irani Shiism, how there's a veneration of the dead, a veneration of past figures indicated in that action of him putting that rock there to act as a grave marker, because currently there's no sort of marker of where the Prophet was buried in Saudi Arabia, despite the fact that it did exist for a majority of Muslim history. It's just not there now because uh, the Salafi movement in Saudi Arabia is not that different from movements like ISIS. It's just it's become domesticated over time. It's just being the head of a government means you have to negotiate and compromise. And over the course of about 150 years, they've become tamer than groups like ISIS might be. Um, uh, and the other stuff like the vocal declaration of one's niyyah, these are a lot of the practices that he's including here in his criticism of Sufism are also criticisms of Shias, kind of disguised as criticisms of Sufis as well. Because Shias, for example, will venerate the Imams in the same way that a Sufi might venerate their sheikh. And so the criticism would hit both of them if you were offering it. Okay. And the consequences of this very conservative, very rigid approach to Islam can result in things like the destruction of the beautiful Bamiyan Buddhas. Oh, pardon me. The Bamiyan Buddhas, which were 6th century monuments of Gautama Buddha that were built in central Afghanistan. They were considered to be some of the largest Buddha statues in existence. You can see in the image on the left what the statue actually looked like in the 1970s. That picture was taken in 1973. And then in 2001, the Taliban decided to dynamite the statue because they believed that it was a form of idolatry. So take for example the fact that this region of Afghanistan has been kind of under Muslim control for over 1,000 years. None of those regimes decided that this was necessary, that the destruction of this monument was necessary. But for some reason, in the modern period, there was a decision that this had to be leveled to the ground. And so it's in the form of art style that we would call Gandharan art style from the Gandharan civilization in the Indus Valley. And in 2001, it was leveled, but there has been something of a ghostly revival of it. Let me just pause the recording here to show you what it looks like today. Sure. If the intention is to rebuild it, to the best of my knowledge, there has not been an attempt to rebuild it. Also, in addition, an attempt to rebuild it may also run into some problems. So generally in Islamic law, there's a sense that subject populations, dhimmi populations, are allowed to maintain their own sites of worship. But a very different question comes up if the site of worship is destroyed. So let's say, for example, you're living in Egypt about 300 years ago, and you have a Christian community in your neighborhood. The Christian community is allowed to have their church because the church has been there for ages. But what is to happen then if the church burns down? Are they allowed to rebuild it? Because it's different to maintain it and rebuild it. In Islamic law, the idea of rebuilding it is giving permission for a new religion to erect its monument in spaces which Islam controls. So rebuilding is very different than repairing. So whether or not they can rebuild this Buddha is going to be invoke very different questions of law is one concern. The other thing is that this project was sort of financed by two very wealthy Chinese donors. And so it represents something of a new relationship that is being forged between the Chinese government and the Chinese people and Afghanistan. And so whether or not it's part of a larger cultural exchange project on that front as well is really up for debate. The presence of China in Afghanistan, in Pakistan, especially related to the belt and road and belt system, I think Xi Jinping has proposed. It's the idea that they just the China wanted land access to the Indian Ocean. And so in Gwadar, for example, in Pakistan, a relative like quiet zone, sort of where Alexander the Great landed, a very quiet previously, now has over $1 billion of infrastructure being constructed by the Chinese government on these sort of some pretty funky loans. For example, one of the how neo-colonialism Chinese expansion works is, for example, in the case of Sri Lanka, they will build a very sophisticated port. And then put the country into debt for that port, and in lieu of repaying the debts, you'll grant China a 99-year lease in that port. So it's a very interesting way of playing the sovereignty game, and very sophisticated as well. But with regards to these Buddhas, it's rather sad. I mean, from a cultural historical point of view, it's terribly sad. But the other thing that this indicates is that there's a Salafi anxiety. About proving their authenticity and proving the fact that they represent a new, masculine, strong, potent Islam, and so acts like this are kind of the norm. And even you saw under ISIS, public crucifixions, mass rapes of Yazidi women, as kind of ways of showing that they had arrived, kind of using atrocity as a way of drawing attention to yourself. But one of the other elements and that I think is necessary to discuss here as well is often there's this criticism of Sufism, just as we saw in the video, is kind of a two-faced criticism, right? On the one hand, it's a criticism of the things you don't like in Sufism, the folk aspects of the religiosity, the snake charming and smoke cleanses and stuff like that. But on the other hand, there seems to be a tendency, especially by important Islamic ideologues, to also engage with Sufism themselves. Take, for example, the case of someone like Maulana Maududi. He a very important Islamist thinker, born in India and then moved to Pakistan. Actually opposed the creation of Pakistan initially, and then changed his position. uh, he was responsible for the founding of the Jamaat-e-Islami, a so-called Salafi organization, very, very active in the universities, especially in the universities where the language of instruction would be English and Urdu, in a very similar way to the Muslim Brotherhood as well. The Muslim Brotherhood, they're not a movement of rubes and idiots. They usually run their recruitment at universities, especially amongst groups like engineers who want to see the world in terms of problems and solutions, just happen to be very susceptible to the kinds of approaches by the Jamaat-e-Islami and the Muslim Brotherhood. Any rate, he was responsible for a lot of the Sharia, sort of Shariatization projects of the dictator Zia, who executed Bhutto's father in 1978-79, and then was responsible for making kind of the laws in Islam in Pakistan much, much more conservative, including bringing in new legislations on things like zina, adultery, in which women would be punished publicly and things like that. So he uh, he was responsible. Like Maulana Maududi was responsible for that kind of thinking, and in addition, he himself was an ideologue of the Islamic State as well. And he had the following to say about Sufis. They polluted the pure spring of Islamic tasawwuf with absurdities that could not be justified by any stretch of the imagination on the basis of the Quran and the Hadith. Gradually, a section of Muslims appeared who taught and proclaimed themselves immune and above the requirements of the Sharia. These people are totally ignorant of Islam, for Islam cannot admit of tasawwuf that loosens itself out of the Sharia and takes liberties with it. No Sufi has the right to transgress the limits of the Sharia or treat lightly the primary obligations such as daily prayers, fasting, zakat, and Hajj. So you're seeing very similar stuff to what we saw in the Russian document, similar to what we heard in the talk on YouTube. Same kinds of criticisms. In addition, one thing that is important to know about Maududi is his family itself is linked to the Chisti Sufi order. In fact, one of the founders of the Chisti Sufi order was himself a Maududi. So a Maududi's ancestor is responsible for founding the Chisti order, which is also where we get music like Qawwali and stuff from. So he comes out of a Sufi lineage, and he himself studies Sufism when he's a child. But what he's doing again is the same thing you heard in that video, is he's drawing this neat distinction between people who can handle it and people who can't. And if you read Maududi's literature generally, he is promoting a program in which he's trying to build Muslim citizens in a Muslim state. And he is choosing what is best for them. And what it exposes in his rhetoric is a certain elitism, in which he's saying stuff like, do as I say, not as I do, right? Because in his what he does, we see actually a much gentler approach to Sufism in his own poetry. Take, for example, he says here, you have a hidden fire within you, so you don't need the candle. The burning desire of the moth became a radiant flame in yourself. Now, we recognize this moth analogy from Rumi, and Maududi himself is claimed to have been responsible for having kind of communicated with Ayatollah Khomeini as well, despite the fact that he's quite anti-Shia. He and Khomeini apparently met while Maududi was on Hajj. And in addition, this kind of the Sufi language being deployed by someone like Maududi is quite shocking for those of us who've only ever heard Maududi's name paired with Islamist names or paired with Islamic State projects. So that's, again, it sort of shows the duality or perhaps hypocrisy, if one wants to talk about it that way. That publicly facing, he's promoting a program which is very conservative, but in his interior life, there's much more room for maneuvering. Or let's take a look at someone like Raullah Khomeini or Ayatollah Khomeini, who was involved in disrupting and displacing a large number of Sufi orders, is generally considered to have an extremely negative perspective on Sufi orders in Iran. But at the same time, he's writing Sufi poetry. For example, a poem called The Wine of Love. Let me just pull that up here. The storm is scary stuff outside. Okay, here we go. Let me read you this poem. Since you have demanded poems from me, this here Khomeini writes by way of introduction. Since you have demanded poems from me with that insistence that is so characteristic of you, I must confess that neither in my youth, which is the season of poetry and sensitivity, which has now been spent, nor in the season of old age, which I have also left behind me, nor in this most decrepit state of life, which I am now wrestling, have I ever had the talent for poetry. It is related that someone had said, my power is no different in old age from what it was in my youth, for I have remained unable to lift this stone both in youth and in old age. I could say the same thing about poetry and literature, for I have remained incapable of them, though both in my old age and my youth I have declared, quote, if a poet, by the word for Al Sadi of Shiraz, what you and I may weave is but a play of dross. Now, since I am incapable of poetry, I'll play a trick and concede to your demands. Ahmad is from Muhammad the Chosen One, from whom the Praised One shall watch from above. Fatih is from the throne of the womb of Fatima, from whom the Creator of the heavens shall love. Hassan is the fruit tree of beauty. Hassan is the fruit tree of beauty. The benefactor shall be his sure companion boon. Yasser of the pure house of the two offspring, the secrets of sanctity shall be strewn. Again, you ask for poetry, so here is some more babble. I am a lover, except for union with you, there is no cure for this. Who is there? Whose soul has not been kindled by this fire except for you? In the assembly of those of burnt hearts, nothing is remembered. This is a story with neither a beginning nor an end. The mystery of the heart cannot be exposed to anyone except the friend, from whom there is neither presence nor absence. With whom may I confide, one that I can never find? See the friend, unless neither thought nor vision is under his control. Open the corner of your eye to look at this poor man. Engage with him in the play of love, for this is a disordered wilderness. Open up the cask and fill the goblet to the brim. So that's, I suspect, not a version of Khomeini any of you have ever encountered before, right? It's generally when people think of Khomeini, they think fire and brimstone. They see the angry speeches. They think perhaps of his condemnation of Salman Rushdie, um, and but not of this sort of Sufi, playful Sufi heart, narrating his poetry in these kind of very playful terms, including drunkenness, wine, the incineration of the moth and the flame. And it shows you often that despite the fact that these figures are coded one way by Western media and Western historians, they often tended to operate very differently within their actual contexts. Um, so now to this last slide. And again, for the members of the public, my apologies. This is where I have to pause the recordings while we visit these websites. But let me just give you a quick example of what the future of cyber of Sufism of the future might look like. So one issue is that, of course, that because of COVID, a lot of these organizations were not able to draw attendees, and in addition, a lot of sort of movements, take for example the illuminated tours. You can go with a scholar, a very good scholar, Omid Safi, on a tour of Turkey and tour the different Sufi spots and sites. In addition, perhaps in better times, we're going to see tours of places like Iran, but also tours of Africa for these sort of Sufi tours. But one of the issues became is when tourist dollars were not coming into these shrines, they suddenly were faced with a bit of a crisis. How do they stay relevant? How do they stay active? And before coronavirus, Rob Rosenhall had written a book called Cybersufism, in which he studies this as a phenomena and development in Islam. And he says the things that you are seeing cyber Sufis engaging in a lot is that they're using websites for things like ritual reminders to tell you when to pray. It orients, in addition, on each of these websites, you're going to see defenses of Sufism, again, that defensive posture as to the larger tradition where it defends Sufi practices and history. In addition, you're going to see the websites are often going to carve a difference between what it means to attend in person and what it means to attend virtually. And then some of them, you're going to see this thing called the virtual baya. Now, here is where I'm going to pause the recording. Yes. So as you could see from those four different websites, and as Finlay is mentioning here as well, that these are highly sophisticated online operations. They have commercial elements, they have ritual elements, they have social elements, they have political elements, and they're all very that the new kind of way of encountering Sufism, especially during the pandemic, when you can't go to shrines, when you can't visit celebrations, is to do it in this fashion online. All right. With all that said, we have wound down to just about the last slide of the term, and as I can see from the expressions of some of your faces, an exciting point to have reached. Thank you again for your attention and your effort during the course of this semester. This is a lot of material. It's a brand new area of study, and I hope I have been a good guide to you. Because again, my goal as a teacher, and I try to state this at the end of every semester, my goal as a teacher is not to make you learn all of the thing that I was supposed to teach you. Rather, it's to teach you how to be able to go out and learn yourself about that subject matter. So it's meant to train you in the senses, how can we tell good sources from bad? How can we tell good arguments from bad? How can we tell sophisticated engagements from uncritical engagements? And how then we can dig deeper and further and come to a more nuanced understanding. In the sense of Sufi literature, we began the semester by looking at how Orientalism and colonialism has shaped our approaches and understanding of Sufism. In addition, then we looked at the historical origins of the movements in places like Iraq and how it spread out to places like India. We have looked at some particular case studies of some saints, some shrines. And although we have stuck rather close to Karl Ernst's book in terms of subject matter, we have used a number of different historical studies to pull in and do this sort of analysis. And my hope is that this will stay for you an engagement that doesn't end at this stage, and that it will continue to ripen and mature for you as you grow and as you think about these issues. There's a sense that our understanding of Sufism inevitably will change with our understanding of our own lives, right? So I was not ready to study Sufism in my early 20s. I just wasn't. I was a little bit wild and just not disciplined enough to read it with an open heart. And now, to go back and read those sources, I feel a certain profundity in the verses of poetry. I feel a certain potency in some of their practices, whereas I would not have thought that before I was a father, before I was in my 40s. So those kinds of things change, and my hope is that for those of you who are here before your 40s, that this will be an invitation to revisit this material as you grow older, and especially something like Rumi, who's considered the most popular poet in Canada and in the United States, how we can read Rumi in a more sophisticated fashion, not just merely on the surface level as pretty poetry about love. With that said, thank you for the members of the public as well that joined us this semester. And for our students, I'm just going to remind you that we're going to break out into our little room where I'll be checking up on you and see how you're doing with regard to your papers. I will post that in the chat right now. And then I will see you there in a couple minutes. But thank you again for everyone that attended, and thank you for staying with us. This was a lot of material this term, under difficult and pressing circumstances of the present, but I hope your professor was useful to you. And please, those of you who have had me before know that if you need a recommendation letter, if you need someone to be an advocate for you, an ally for you, most of you have proved yourself to me over and over again in a number of courses, and I'm here to support your careers and support you going forward. So please know that as well. All right, wonderful. See you in the other room. See you shortly.